I am excited. We are in our 25th, 26th week going through the book of Genesis, and today we are ending this series called The Wanderer. This is the last one in the life of Abraham. So, bad news, Abraham's not going to make it through this message, but he's had a good life, 175 years, so we're going to celebrate the life of Abraham today. We're not going to mourn it. But I want to talk today kind of about the idea that this whole has flown through this whole idea, and that is this idea of faith. And I want y'all to see from the very beginning of God's word, as we look back into the Old Testament, we see that it is not what we sometimes think about the Bible. We sometimes think I've just got to be good enough, that the Bible is just a rule book I got to follow. But instead, what we see is an imperfect man who's living this life, and God basically says, even in all your flaws, even all of the things that you do wrong, because of your faith in me, God says, I am going to give you righteousness. In other words, I'm going to make you good enough. And that theme we've seen every single week. Abraham has done things that if you or I did, we would lose our job, we would lose our family, we would lose everything. But yet, God has still kept his hand on Abraham. And so today we're going to end this series where we begin with this idea of faith. Abraham was a man of faith, but today I want to give you a skill that I think is one of the most important skills you can have if you want to be a person of faith. And then to start us off, I want you to think of a day in your life in which you can kind of remember the entire events of the day because of something traumatic or major that happened that day. For example, my father-in-law was about a quarter mile away from Daley Plaza when President Kennedy was shot. And what's amazing is he can tell you events from that day, even though he was young then, and he can still remember events or things about that day that most people had nothing happen. They would not remember that day from any other day. Can you think of a day in your life that you're like, man, that's a big day? For me, the first kind of day I had where, man, this day, I just remember where I was. I remember what I was doing. I was actually playing at a friend's house the first time I saw this. The first time I heard of this event, I was in school, and some of the classes got to watch this event. This was on January 28th, 1986, which when the Challenger exploded. And so we heard, I didn't see it at school, but then that night I was at a friend's house and I remember watching it on the news, and I just remember what I was doing when I heard. I remember it stopped us down, and I just remember things about that event. Now, of course, if you're over a certain age in this room, almost all of us have, and I'm not pointing just at you, John, but I know it feels that way sometimes. No, I remember where I was on September 11th, and I think a lot of us have that experience. I was in Hebrew class, and you thought Hebrew class was bad. Normally, imagine I walked in and I saw it on the TV, and they turned it off so that we could have class, and he made us sit through class, and his comment was, hey, it's still going to be there after class. The Lord wants us in Hebrew class. He didn't say that, but he kind of intimated that. But I remember everything about that day. And so we've had those experiences, but one of the things that's interesting about our day and age now is that we're beginning to kind of get into this place where these experiences more and more are being taken a hold of. And to give you, and this is just one example, I'm not trying to be political here, but one example of just this phenomenon that was 9/11 was shared by the entire world. It was and certainly the entire country. Kennedy's assassination was shared by the entire world and certainly this country. But what was interesting is this year, we had an event in which some people in our country thought was the most traumatic incident that has occurred in this country, and then some of us thought it was Wednesday. And that was the events of January 6th, and I don't want to get into politics, but I find it what's interesting is, as we look on both sides, the conservative writer George Will said that this is an event that should go down in history on par with 9/11. And then you had the Huffington Post, which said that certainly this is 1,000 times worse than 9/11. And even today, it's on the front page of certain news sites. And the only reason I bring it up is because this morning and this week, I went back in my journal because I couldn't remember what I was doing on that day. I went in my journal, and what was fascinating to me is I don't even have a journal entry of that event. Like, to me, the big thing for that day was that Joey and I went and had lunch at a barbecue restaurant. I was like, that's what I remember about that day. And yet, for a certain part of our people, it was, I don't know how you feel about it, it was a traumatic day. Some people, hopefully, I kind of heard it as an event, but to me, it didn't really even register. But now, we are kind of in this place where no matter what happens, and I don't want to get your mind on all the tangents, but every single event now becomes something in which a part of the population is going to grab hold of one way and is going to tell you this is the worst thing that's ever happened. And then there's going to be a part of the story, and some people are going to take it and say this is the best thing to ever happen. And then there's going to be most of the people who don't have a voice and just going to be like, okay, I see both these things happened. Maybe I'm for it or against it, but it's not life-altering. I didn't write it in my journal. I don't remember the details of the day. But now we see this almost regular. We've seen, at least if you were to read the news, you would see this consistently as if, man, this year has just been, you should remember every single day because something traumatic is happening every single day. It's almost the way the news cycle reads to us now. The truth is, this is just something that the media has always been good at, but now the media does very well, and that is they reframe a story to an agenda. And we know this isn't a big deal. But this idea of reframing something to an agenda, as I think, when the media is doing this, I think it is a very destructive thing. But overall, this idea of reframing a story is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, every memory you have, I hate to tell you this, isn't actually what happened. It's how you framed what happened. And in fact, there's a healthy thing that you can do when it comes to reframing is you can actually do what's called a cognitive reframing. And this is kind of a good thing. This is when, maybe your car breaks down, so you say to yourself, I'm stuck at home. But then you can reframe that and you can say, you know what? I am safe at home today. Or maybe if you have an experience where you think, you know what, my wife, she got invited to go out with her girlfriends or whatever. She's going to have a party, and that's great. So, man, I'm going to be stuck at home with the kids. Now, we would never say that, that's right. But you could say, you know what, that's great because I'm a dad, and what should dads do? They should stay home and just hang out with my kids. My wife gets to be happy. I get to be happy. And tonight isn't about me. It's about being with my kids. What a great day. It's all about how you reframe it. And so when it comes to life, you need to understand we're all reframing. We're all reframing it. But one of the most important things we do as followers of Christ, as godly people, is we theologically reframe our lives. And that's what we're going to talk about today, this idea of theological reframing. And this is how I would define theological reframing. Basically, I would say it's telling my story as if it is God's story. Telling my story as if it is a part of God's story. Because if I'm just telling you, man, I went through life and it's just bad things are happening to me, good things are happening, man, it was a rough day, and we're going to go through life like this. But there's a certain thing that a faithful person can do when they begin to see their entire life not as, man, it's either a good day or a bad day because of what happened to me, but instead to say, you know what? Overall, God has a plan, God is working, God is doing stuff in this world. And because of that, I get to play a part of that. And so we theologically reframe. We say, I'm a part of what God is doing. And all of a sudden, the bad things and the good things become teaching moments. Or, hey, this is that part of the movie where everything's hard, but the only reason it's hard is because we know he's going to fix it in the end. And so as we see this story that we started last week, this is a perfect, I want to kind of end on this idea of theological reframing because everything that happens in Abraham's life is something we can look at and say, you know what, if you just take the story, if you just take the one pixel of the picture, man, this is a bad day for Abraham. It was an evil day. He did wrong on this day. But you look at the whole thing and you begin to say, man, even in his worst days, God was doing something throughout his life. There's a quote by Andy Stanley, and this is going to be kind of the big idea for the day. But Andy Stanley said this. He says, if I see as God sees, I'll do as God says. If I see as God sees, I'll do as God says. A lot of us, we struggle to walk in faith and to obey and to really give our lives fully over to God. But if we see as God sees, if we could see eternity, if we could see life in the fact that from God's perspective, the day you die it is not this traumatic event that ends everything. It's just a little blip on your radar in which, hey, that's the day that he went from this life to the next life, but your life continued. And this was the day, in fact, it's an even better life. This is the day you entered into the presence. This is the day as Christ followers, when we see as God sees, all of a sudden our lows aren't as low. So when we go through this story today in Genesis 24, this is the end of Genesis 24, I want you to see how a faithful person reframes their story in light of God's story. And so we're going to begin in verse 29 of chapter 24. And if you weren't here last week, and I know we didn't get the live stream, last week Satan did not want the message out. We had a recorder go down, we had the secondary recorder go down, and the live stream went down, which means, and by the way, it was the best message I've ever preached in my life, and my hair was perfect. If you missed it and weren't here, man, it was probably the best experience you could have had in church. But today will be the second, so we're good, right? I'm going to retell the story, but in the story, the entire events from last week's story get retold, and this is something that happens in literature of this time. They would retell in the same story. We see this is not unique, but he's going to retell the story in the story, and this is one of the ways that they would memorize it. So there's a practical reason that this happens in ancient literature. They would retell a story so that you could remember the story. Okay, so we're going to pick it up in 29. The major players you need to know is, first of all, it started off with Abraham talking to his servant Eleazar. Eleazar's name isn't mentioned, but so we speculate it's Eleazar because that was his chief servant. That's who he would have sent on this duty. And he sent Eleazar to find a wife for his son Isaac. Remember, Isaac is the kind of the promised son that God said would go through Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Abraham, even though they were too old and couldn't have children. And Eleazar goes off and he goes to the birthplace of Abraham. He goes to his hometown, basically, and he finds this woman, Rebekah. And so when you hear these names, that's who's going on. And Rebekah had a brother, Laban. In fact, that's where we begin. 29. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Now Laban ran out towards the man to the spring, and as soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arm, those are what Eleazar had given, and heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels of the spring. And just so you know, Laban, her brother, thinks, man, Rebekah hit the jackpot. He's got 10 limousines out front. She's wearing Rolexes all over her hand. That's our equivalent, okay? These are like $60,000 rings. These camels are not native to that area. They came from Egypt, and nobody he knows has one camel, let alone just a little bit of his fleet comes with him on this journey, and Abraham actually has more. Abraham's showing his wealth because he wants to impress whoever is going to be his new daughter-in-law, and Laban catches on to this, and he runs out there. I've prepared the house, a place for the camel, in the house, a place for the camels. So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels and gave straw and fodder to the camels, and there was water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then the food was set before him to eat, but he said, and this is Eleazar speaking. Eleazar is being wined and dined because they see, wow, you like our sister, you like our daughter, Rebekah, you've said these great things. I'm very intrigued. And Eleazar is invited into the house. They take care of all of his stuff, and then they begin to wine and dine him. And he says, I will not eat until I've said what I have to say. And so that's when Laban says, speak on. So I just want to kind of, as we are about to retell the entire story, I want you to see why Laban is doing this. Why Eleazar is doing this. Eleazar has just experienced something that has been to him miraculous. He has gone on a journey in which he was sent on, and if you go back and remember last week, he didn't believe this was going to be a successful journey. He even gave himself a way out. He said, hey, if this doesn't work out, what do I do? And Abraham said, you can forget about it if it doesn't work out. He had this doubt, but now all of a sudden, every single detail seems to be aligning to this one thing that he had been praying that would happen. And so he's going to retell this story through a different perspective. He's going to reframe it to the idea that, listen, God is the hero of the story. I didn't set out and do and accomplish all this stuff. All this stuff was accomplished through me because God is doing something fascinating here. So, faithful people, this is the big idea of the sermon, faithful people connect their story to God's greater story. This is a key. If you want to be joyful in life, if you want to have peace when things are not going so well, the first thing you've got to realize is it's not my story. There's a greater story happening here. And so even my low parts, the valleys of my life can be a part of God's greater story, especially when we look at the big picture and see how God sees. And so he's going to put this in perspective, and he's going to tell the story of everything that just happened, except now you're going to see some just little highlights. He's going to recount it, but he's going to begin to say, you know what? This is actually all God's work. Reframing your story in light of a greater story is a skill of faith, and not everyone can do it. I'll give you an example. When the year started, Eric and I had some big plans. In fact, some of these plans came through. We refinanced our house, and we had budgeted out of that refinance some things to where it was just we were going to be able to redo our backyard a little bit. And one of the things that she really had her eyes set is she wanted a new garage door. We have an old garage door. It's been banged up. It's been replaced, all this stuff. And she had this garage door picked out that she wanted to get. And so that was going to be our August project, was redoing our garage door. We had already redone the actual garage floor and all this. And so we were excited about it. It was going to make our house look better. All of these things that, let's be honest, she cares about more than me. But I was like, okay, we do it. We put the money aside. We saved that money. And then an interesting thing happened. My son, in the month of May, gets accepted to North Texas, to which he did not even complete the application. Okay? My son, by the way, he is thriving in North Texas right now. But in high school, which was only a few months ago, he had a different perspective. He was given this application, he fills it out, and then the last one is like, okay, now fill out the essay. And he's like, oh my gosh, I can't go, I'm not going to that school. And he doesn't finish it, okay? And I'm not kidding you. All of a sudden, we're in May, and I don't know how the light of God shone down through it, but he gets this acceptance letter, to which me and him look at each other when he gets it, and did you? No. Okay, I guess you're going to North Texas. And all of a sudden, now every time I drive into this day into my house, and I don't drive into my house, I go into the garage, and I see this rickety door that I'm going through. It's this reminder, not of the fact that, man, we didn't get a garage door. We got to give money to North Texas. That's what we got to do. But we reframe it now, right? We have to remind ourselves, man, we're driving through the door that sent our son to college, right? We're driving through this opportunity. Man, what a blessing that we get to drive through this rickety door and see it every single day. In fact, there's got some bolts I need to tighten down because right now there's a part of it that hangs down that almost hits my car every time. But man, what a blessing, because that's what sent my son. That's how we were able to say, yes, we had this money that was set aside, and it was I guess allotted to whatever God's will was for in August. And we were able to say, you know what? Thank goodness we had this money. We had to reframe it, not through our story, but through a greater story. Someday I told my wife, listen, 2022 is called the year of the garage door in our hand, okay? It's going to happen. But every time we walk through that, we're never going to forget this is something better. This is our son who, his life changed and went in a different direction, and we didn't even expect it. What a blessing that garage door is. By the way, we also had a Disney vacation that me and my wife were going to go on by ourselves. That also gets thrown into the North Texas dream as well. So, man, God's reminding us all over the place. What a blessing it is that we have this son that is getting his life to just thrive right now. So it begins to tell this story. I am Abraham's servant. And I want you to just begin to notice how he begins to point this story to the Lord. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great. He's given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants and female servants, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and it was given to him, and to him he has given all that he has. Everything, he looks rich, but it's really not him. God is rich, and God has given him a lot of stuff. That's the way that this servant begins to tell the story of Abraham. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughter of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell. But you shall go to my father's house and to my clan to take a wife. I said to my master, perhaps the woman will not follow. And he said to me, the Lord, before whom I have walked, will send his angel to prosper you on the way. In other words, Abraham had this faith. Abraham was living as if, you know what, this is in my story. Somehow or another, this is going to happen because I have this faith. I'm walking in this belief that, listen, if it's God's story and God has said we're going to have a godly family who is going to be this lineage that's going to change the world, that somehow he's going to bless all the nations. That was the promise, remember. He's going to bless all the nations through us. Then God will see to it. He will send his angel. You shall take a wife for my son from the clan of my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath. If you can't, he says, you will be free from my oath. When you come to my clan, if they will not give her to you, you will be free. I came today to the spring and I said, and prayed this prayer, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, please give me a little drink of water from your jar to drink. And to whom I will say to me, drink, and I will draw for you water for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. So he prays this prayer to God, and he says, listen, if this is the woman that God is going to move through, then I prayed this prayer that God would reveal it in this way. She's going to water my camels. And we talked about this last week. If you're watching online, you'll just have to ask. This was a big 2-hour job of a lot of work. And whoever does that, whoever the woman who comes and commits to this and shows that this is a hardworking woman that just wants to be a servant to me, that's who, or to have a servant's heart towards me. He says, that's how I'm going to identify her. But it's not going to be her and it's not going to be me. It's going to be God working. Verse 45, before I finished speaking, my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew water. And I said to her, please let me drink. And she quickly let down her jars from her shoulder and said, drink, I will give your camels water also. So I drank, and she gave the camels drink also. Then I asked her, whose daughter are you? And she said, I am the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom his Milcah bore to him. That's the Nahor is the brother of Abraham. All of a sudden he realizes this is God acting in this promise. So he put a bracelet on her arms. Then I bowed my head and I worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, whom had led me the right way to the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me. And if not, tell me so that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. So he retells the whole story, only this time as he's telling it to Rebekah and her father and her brother. And her brother, by the way, is going to be the one who makes the decision on whether or not she can be married in this case. He tells his story, but instead of saying, listen, I've come all this way, I did this, I looked here, and I saw this, and I did that. Instead, he tells his story of, listen, God told me through Abraham, my master, hey, I'm going to go here, and there's going to be all of these challenges, but I'm going to be able to identify it, and God's going to be working here, and God's going to be working here, and God's going to bring the right person here. And he looks at this exact story we heard last week, and he does it through these eyes as he's telling the story. This isn't my story. This is what God is doing. And he basically presents to them an opportunity. Do you want to be a part of what God is doing? If so, let me know right now. If not, let me know and I'll go on and I'll go this way or that way. But he has this kind of underlying faith of wherever I go, it's not my story. As long as I'm obedient and I'm seeking God's heart, God's story is unfolding here. God's moving and I'm just going to obey, and wherever he goes, God's going to get me to the right place. He has this confidence, because he's now reframed the entire experience that he just had as, you know what, this is my story in light of God's greater story. Verse 50, and by the way, this is the longest chapter in Genesis, if you haven't figured that out. So we're gonna keep going. We'll be on time. Then Laban, and by the way, Laban's going to come back. If you know the story of Genesis, Laban's going to come back. Laban turns out to be a scoundrel. He turns out to be not a good guy. He turns out to be a guy who would run out just because he saw camels and try to manipulate a situation and try to get as much as he can out of somebody. But even Laban hears this story. The thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you good or bad. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. Now, we don't know his motives, but it seems that after hearing the servant say, you know what, this isn't from me, this is from God, even Laban is beginning to say, you know what, it sounds like God is really in the works here. It sounds like God is doing something here. When Abraham's servant heard these words, he bowed himself before the Lord. And the servant brought out jewelry and silver and gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. And he also gave them to her brother most costly ornaments. And he and the men that were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. And when they arose that morning, he said, this is Eleazar, said, send me away to my master. And her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain for us for a while, for at least 10 days, and then she may go. But he said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me so that I may go to my master. And they said, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah, and they said, will you go with this man? Now, Rebekah hadn't heard this from that perspective, but she had already talked with Eleazar, so she's already seen this from the perspective of, man, God has brought me to this place, and he has blessed my efforts to serve, and he has done these things. And so Rebekah says, I will go. So they sent Rebekah and her sister and her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said, may our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s. May your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. This is basically a kind of a formal way, singing a little song and blessing and saying, hey, listen, we think God's at work here. And so they pray this, or they give this little blessing of God's doing something here. But I want you to see how contagious this reframing of Eleazar is. Somebody, if you've ever been around somebody who every single thing, man, is a blessing from the Lord, even in the low points, it's a blessing because they know, hey, God's going to work out of this. God's going to do something out of this. Even Laban, God uses selfish Laban to be a part of this story and lets him even weave in a couple more times throughout the book of Genesis. You see, when we see as God sees, not only will we do what he does, but it prepares us to do as God sees. Seeing as God sees prepares me to do what God says. If you've ever struggled in your faith, I would challenge you to begin looking at the events of your life and say, you know what? God is preparing me for something. God is doing something even in this hard season. It's been easy to reframe the last few years for this church. In fact, there's a lot of things that we've had to reframe, and this is a skill that if you've done well, you're probably a lot more content, a lot more joyful right now than if you haven't. You think about COVID-19 and all of this pandemic. I remember, and as many of you probably do, the first time when I heard, you know what, we're not going back to school. In fact, that means the church isn't going back to school. And as we begin to see what's going to happen, all of a sudden as we reframe it, we know that even though we didn't meet as a church, look, we've still stayed together as a church. You guys did a great job of staying connected because we're more than just a building, we're more than just a place. And now we know that because we've been tested at that. But not only that, now we have not 2 staff members, we have 4 staff members. And a lot of that came because it gave us this confidence to say, you know what, we're going to take a step of faith, and we've saved money that put us in a position to bring on not just Ashley, but to Fadswa as well. And that, man, what a blessing it is to put us in this position to where now we can say yes to our student ministry, which is about to begin. And not only that, our next phase of our church, where we're looking at where we are going to land as a building. And now all of a sudden, we've got double the money we had when we moved into this location. Do you realize that? So even though it's been hard, yeah, you can clap for that, that's fine. Even though it's been hard, and none of us here would have chosen a pandemic, at least I hope you wouldn't have chosen, we can still look back and say, you know what? Even though our story was hard, man, God was moving in our story. In fact, when we move into that building and as we just begin to pray through our next push to get into, there's going to be a part of our story in which, you know what, we didn't know if we were ever going to get in there, but we made about 10 years worth, or it seems like 5 years worth of savings and just moving forward in the midst of everything shutting down. Not because Joel's smart, let's make that clear. I would have done everything we've done, I would have done the opposite. But yet God has moved us so far because it's his greater story. And so we see that we're prepared to take these steps as we begin to reframe what we're doing. And sometimes there's a point in which you just got to make some godly decisions with this. So we see Rebecca. She's prepared for this because, you know what, she's heard this story and she's now looking at it not through should I go and spend the rest of my life in a foreign place where I don't know and with people I don't know? That's a tough decision. But now she's looking at it through the eyes of, man, God is moving here. It's not me going alone. Apparently, God is going with me apparently he's got greater things for me than I ever imagined was going to be in my life. I thought I was going to marry, the next door neighbor, and he's not all that great. But now I've got this guy pulling up with his 10 camels and giving me these bracelets and these, man, I just didn't see this coming. And it seems to be that it's a blessing from God. You think about the disciples. They meet Jesus, and then all of a sudden they've got to make this decision. And some of us, we just say, of course, Jesus walks up to you, go. But if you don't know, if you've never met Jesus, they make this decision because they see for the first time a rabbi, somebody who is looking at these fishermen who the world might have given up, but all of a sudden they say, you know what, maybe if a rabbi is going to speak into, maybe if he's telling me I can be a fisher of men, if I can be somebody who impacts the world, maybe I'll do that. And godly people just have this way of saying, this is a part of God's story. God's doing something here, so I'm going to obey. I'm going to follow along, even when it's hard, even if I don't see it. They reframe the entire story as if it's not their story. It's God's story, and we're just obeying, and he's choosing to let us be a part of it. Verse 61. Rebekah and her young woman arose, and they rode on camels and followed the man. And the servants took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had returned from Beer Lahai Roi. If you remember that's where Rahab was when God saw her. And so there's this interweaving into this place where Rahab was. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field. His eyes are set on God. He's listening to God. He knows that his father's servant is out looking for his wife, and so he's probably praying, at least I would be, God, bring me a good wife, bring me a good wife. And then Isaac went up, and he's meditating in the field, and he lifted his eyes, and he saw, behold, there were camels coming, and Rebekah lifted her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel, and she said to her servant, who is that man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, it is my master. And this kind of gives us a hint. Maybe Abraham has died, by the way, in this story, and we just haven't been told it yet, but it's Isaac that's coming out. So she took the veil and she covered herself. This is what, in that time, this is what a bride would do. A bride would wear a veil. They still do, except for the bride would wear the veil the whole time they're in the season before marriage. And so she puts this veil and she's basically showing Isaac, hey, I'm the one that they chose for you. I'm your bride to be. And Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, who passed away, remember. And he took Rebekah and she became his wife and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Now, a couple of details I just want to hash out real quick before we close this out. But first of all, it's odd that Abraham isn't in this story anymore. So it does kind of, there's a couple of reasons. Either the author is trying to make sure we know this isn't about Abraham, this is about Isaac and his servant. But really, it's more likely that he's either sick or that Abraham has passed away, because in chapter 25 is when Abraham dies, okay? Abraham dies, but it's just a recounting. It doesn't go into how he dies. It's just a recounting of he lived 175 years, which we've talked about may or may not be the actual number, but there's meaning behind those numbers. And so he's passed away. We know that, and he lived a full life, and but there's not a story of how he died. And so it's likely that at some point on this journey, or even before that, or it would have been on this journey, or maybe a little after that, he dies before she gets back. Okay, so Abraham has apparently passed away. But another thing I want you to see is that it talks about the tent of Sarah and about the mourning of Sarah. And so one of the things that you need to understand about this time, they're called the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac. Those are the patriarchs. But understand there's also matriarchs, that the family was a very important unit. And even though none of these families, you never want a biblical marriage. Let me just say that. You never want a biblical marriage. You want a Christian marriage, but you don't want a biblical marriage because all of the Abraham had other concubines, okay? And we find that in verse 25. In fact, if you read through verse 25, the record will scratch a couple of times as you're like, really? He had concubines? He had wives? He had other people that aren't a part of the story? Again, he's an imperfect man. But one of the things I want you to see is that Sarah is still, even though she's passed away, they've been setting up her tent every single place they go. As they've wandered around, they're still setting up the tent of Sarah because she's the matriarch. And so when Rebekah goes into the tent, this is symbolic of Rebekah is becoming the matriarch. This is the torch is being passed to Isaac and to Sarah. They are now the leaders of the clan. They're now the ones that all of these servants now belong to them. And when we go back and we think about where this entire story started, of God saying to Abraham, through you, you're going to have generations. And remember, he couldn't have children at the time. That was an impossible dream. And it's going to be through him and his wife. There was no way this was going to happen. But little did he know at that time, God was weaving a story that was going to take him to Egypt, that was going to have him fight battles against kings, that was going to take him to Jerusalem to worship with this mysterious man, Melchizedek, and this entire story that we've woven through. He's going to see Sodom and Gomorrah and the disaster that was. All of these things. God was weaving this story that was going to lead to the fulfillment with his son, Isaac, and his wife taking over and fulfilling this lineage that eventually is going to work out into the saving of the entire world. And all these falls that we've seen in Genesis, all of a sudden it's going to be worked out through this. So remember, the first thing, I want to give you just a few things to remember. The first thing I want you to see is remember, it is God's story. It is all God. Think about just this story that we've heard today. There were so many opportunities for this to go bad, right? The servant could have said no. He could have failed. He could have missed and not been so in tune to what God was doing. He could have not seen Rebekah, or he could have had a different test that was not the test of Rebekah. It could have been a totally crazy test. But instead, every single detail seems to work out. But there's this confidence that no matter what happens, as long as Eleazar was obedient, God was going to work this story out. So one of the things I want you to kind of just keep in the back of your mind as your story goes along is that no matter how messed up you think your life's going, is that how far from God or how far from God's will you think it is right now, I want you to remember that even in the ups and downs, when you see as God sees, you'll be prepared, you'll be willing to do as God said. And you'll say, God is doing something even in your valleys. We also see that there's this emphasis on the next generation, that it was important that they not only have children, but that they raise these children the right way. Understand, that's the reason they did not want a Canaanite wife, because the Canaanites were sacrificing children. They were doing a lot of things that Abraham did not want. He could do business with them, but he did not want their heart and their betrayal of God to be a part of his family. And so he makes the decision to go get this. But for us, we've got to see a part of what God is doing in our life, he's doing also in the children of our families. That's the reason our youth ministry, starting a youth ministry and serving in the kids, all these things matter, because the next generation, we're always only one generation away from losing what God is doing. But Abraham has this faith that, I'm going to obey, and it's going to filter into my kids. As we close out the series, and I'm going to go ahead, I'll invite the band up right now and we'll close. But I want to just remind us where we started. We started with an idea of faith, that being good is not about, or that finding God and being a part of God's story is not about being good. But yet every one of us says, I came to church, and so I was, God's got to like me because, some people didn't come to church. And we think everything about this world is about being good enough, doing the right things. So the ultimate question is, how do I connect my story with God's story? How did Abraham connect his story with God's story? And that's what I want you to take away from this entire series. He was a wanderer. It's a wanderer. In fact, we made this whole set back here of beautiful set just so you could see the fields of wandering. It took us 17 weeks to get it done, but we finally got it done. Now, he was wandering, and God, I think, chose him to come and wander his whole life. Because God wanted to show you, it's not about being good enough. It's not about doing the right things. And when he wanders here, sometimes he wanders. That's kind of a picture of sometimes we wander off from God. Sometimes we wander down to Egypt. Sometimes we wander in the wrong direction. And so as we look at his life, you see, it wasn't about the little mistakes he made, the big mistakes he made. Instead, from the very beginning of the story, we've said it every week, it was about this faith that he had, that he was anchored in faith even when he was wandering the land. And so some of us right now feel as if we're wandering. You may feel like this idea of we're wandering. Maybe you think, you know what, I'm trying to be good. I'm trying to be good, but I'm stuck in the same sins that I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I feel like I should be progressing and getting better as a person, but I still fall into these same ruts. I just feel like I'm lost. I feel like I'm wandering. Maybe you just have a sense of shame and something happened to you or something that just from your past won't go away, and you feel like, hey, I'm a Christian now. I should be so anchored. I should be so locked in, but I still feel as if I'm just a wanderer, as if I haven't figured life out at all. We read the story as if Abraham had his life figured out, but when we nail down to it, he was just as lost sometimes as you and I are. The story of Abraham's life is not the story of Abraham being good. It's the story of God doing something greater and calling Abraham to it and then doing it for him. Understand, as Christians, our story is not that we are great people. It's not that we are the smartest people. It's not even that we're gurus that know how to eat and live this, really awesome life. Our story is the fact that we were lost, we were wandering, we had hearts of shame and guilt. And Jesus Christ came to this world. He was the lineage, this promise, the fulfillment is what he said. He is the fulfillment that started with Abraham. And he came to this earth. He lived the perfect life that we can't live. He died on a cross to pay the debt that you and I couldn't pay. But then he rose from the grave saying, you know what? I am indeed the fulfillment, the Savior, the promised one that went all the way back to Abraham. And it's not because you are good that you received this gift. It's because God is good. It's because you had the faith to say, even when I wander away, I will anchor in the fact that God is still moving in my life. And he is the one that came to this earth and made it possible. He is the one that rose from the grave so that I can have confidence that my story is a part of God's story. If I see as God sees, I'll do as he says. And the best part is I'll receive what he gave. Let me pray. Lord, my hope and my heart for this church during this series is that we quit trying to be good enough. We quit trying to get rid of our shame. We quit trying to get ourselves into the perfect conditions so that we can live this awesome life. And we lose your perspective. This life is just a blip when we look at eternity. When we see as you see, we have an entire eternity awaiting us in your presence, in which it's going to be your heart in us, your righteousness in us. You're going to be the one that makes sure that we are close to you. And no matter how many times we have failed, no matter how poor we are at living this life, whether every business deal falls apart, every time we speak to our kids, the words come out wrong and it just seems to drive them away. Every time we try to do the right thing, we just seem to do the wrong thing. Lord, as we begin to anchor our faith in you as we wander, I pray that we'll walk out of this saying, you know what? There is a greater story here being told, and thank God he invited me into it. Lord, we praise you. We give you, Jesus, all the credit for doing what we couldn't do and for making our story great. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.